Hi, good evening. So what I want to talk about today is the structure of the European Upper Paleolithic record as a whole. How we study it, how we conceptualize it, how we analyze it. And this isn't based on a particular research project. This is based on the work that I've been doing more or less actually since I did my master's, my Papa Master's at UCL a few years ago. So through my doctoral work, through the postdocs that I've done, looking in various ways at the Eastern European archaeological record in particular, trying to put some structure onto it. And there's been various problems I've had down the line with doing that, various conceptual problems in particular that I've had. And so the positions that I want to present to you today are based on the things that I've learned through that process. In terms of the structure of the talk, first of all, what I want to do is to look head on at how it is at the moment that we structure the Upper Paleolithic record. I want to talk about some of the problems that we know exist with this, some of which are very widely acknowledged. I want to talk about some of the origins of certain concepts that we tend to take for granted at the moment. And finally, what I want to do is to present to you a different way of looking at the Upper Paleolithic record, which is actually very simple, but which I think potentially can get us past a lot of problems that we've been trying to deal with for a very long time now in the study of the European Upper Paleolithic record. So, when we talk about the cultural taxonomy of the European Upper Paleolithic, these are some of the terms that will be very familiar. So anyone who's had anything to do with the Upper Paleolithic will be acquainted with at least some of these terms here. We use these units, these taxonomic units, to help us categorize sites. We use them for museum work. We use them for teaching. We organize our discipline according to them. So it's quite normal for us to consider ourselves a specialist in one or the other of these units. It's quite normal to have conferences dedicated to one of them, edited volumes, etc. This is really how it works within our disciplines. It's very highly structured according to these units. And on a conceptual level, there's a very widespread idea that these units describe something important about the structure of the Upper Paleolithic record. And there's quite an essentialist aspect, I would say, to these conceptualizations. So if something is Gravettian, if a site is known to be Gravettian, then if we can say something about that site, then we can say something about the Gravettian as a whole, for example. The differences between these units are also held to be important. So there's this idea that there's something fundamentally different about the Aurignacian and the Gravettian. They also get used very frequently as analytical units. So, for example, if someone is doing a study on raw material movements or on isotopes or on prey composition, whatever it might be, it's very normal for people to organize their results and to present their results in terms of a comparison between two different taxonomic units. So they're very, very fundamental terms and concepts. They also have very profound connections with population concepts. And the transitions between these units, or the frontiers between these units, are often seen in terms of population differences or replacements. Not everyone does this, but some people certainly do. And on top of that, we also often hear talk about the Magdalenians, for example, or the Aurignacians. It's quite natural for people often to talk about populations that are associated with one or other of these taxonomic units. The degree to which people take this literally or not is varied, of course. But it's certainly something that you hear a lot, that you read a lot when you're dealing with the Upper Paleolithic. So all of the things I've just said are, I think, very obvious to those of us who work within this area. They're not very often questions, they're not very often talked about. And the reason that I'm just stating the obvious, essentially, to begin this talk, is because I want us to look at them head on. And I want us to realize that this way of describing and interpreting the Upper Paleolithic record is not obligatory. Now, although these units are very well established, we know that there's certain problems with them. There's certain problems with this system. And some of these known issues are as follows. We know that there is a lack of equivalence between units in terms of their scope, their geographical and their chronological scope, and in the amount of variation that they encompass. So the amount of variation in material culture that a particular unit sort of covers is not the same for every single unit. Some units have quite a small geographical and chronological scope. Some of them have a very large scope. And this is very well known. We also know that the creation of these units has really been done on an ad hoc basis. There's been very little that's been systematic about how these units have been created, which ones have been retained, which ones have been got rid of down the years, which ones have been replaced by other units, for example. There's no agreement on the criteria for how we define these taxonomic units. It's sort of done on a case-by-case basis. It depends on who's working on it. It depends on the material that we have. It depends on the tradition in which we're working. And on top of that, there's various known effects to do with, for example, political histories, nationalism being a very obvious and very important one, that have affected how these units have been created and how they've been dealt with. Linguistic issues in modern Europe, who can read each other's papers, who can talk to each other, that's a big problem as well. Also, just the sort of what I've put here is geographical, chronological, and geological biases. So the fact that we simply know more about certain parts of the archaeological record than we do about others. We tend to know more, we tend to have a better chronological handle on more recent parts of the Upper Paleolithic than on the more ancient parts of the Upper Paleolithic. And so there's heaps of papers that you can read that will discuss these various factors in how we've looked at or the effects of these various factors in shaping our understanding of these different taxonomic units. Now, to give you a couple of examples, if we take, for example, the Epigravettian, there's not really any agreement on what it is that characterizes Epigravettian assemblages. The distinction between Gravettian, which is more ancient, and Epigravettian, which is more recent, assemblages is very unclear. It's really not clear how we should draw that boundary apart from essentially an arbitrary chronological bound. And similarly, the distinction between Magdalenian and Epigravettian assemblages, which is supposed to have existed more or less, which are supposed to have been created more or less simultaneously, is very unclear. If we look at the Gravettian, the geographic and chronological bounds that limit the distribution of what we call Gravettian sites are, to my mind, essentially arbitrary. So the fact that we see Gravettian sites just as being restricted to Europe, I don't really see a good reason for that actually comes from the archaeological evidence. And the chronological boundary, especially with Epigravettian sites which are younger, is, to me, not very well founded in an actual archaeological distinction that we can see in the record. And the upshot of all this is to say that if we were starting from scratch now, trying to do the same thing again, trying to make taxonomic units, we would not come up with the same units that we have now. They're very shaped by the history of research, by the order in which things have been discovered, by the attention that's been given to certain things over other things. there's been a degree of theoretical criticism as well of these units. So not only specific units and our knowledge of them, but also the whole endeavor really of making these units. And so one good example of this is a paper from a few years ago by Jeffrey Clark and Julian Rael Salvatore, where they say that we suggest that we don't even know what the conventional archaeological analytical units are or mean or represent in behavioral terms. It is a facile assumption of those who have faith in the adequacy of the existing systematics that we are discovering via retouched stone artifact typology, something very like the remains of identity-conscious social units analogous to the tribes, peoples, and nations of history. And although I don't agree with every aspect of their critique that they make in that paper, they have a point. They have a point. And the nature of these units and what it is that they're supposed to represent is problematic. It's problematic. We don't really understand it very well. We talk about it, I think, quite a lot in informal terms, but we don't often write about it because it's tricky. But I think especially if you're looking at things, if you're looking at the European Upper Paleolithic record as a whole, these questions really come to the fore. If you're just concentrating perhaps on one small region, one small area, perhaps you don't have to grapple with them so intensely. But I think once you start zooming out a little bit, these kind of questions do come up pretty quickly. The second quote that I have there is from a very widely read paper by John Shea, which was actually dealing with the Middle and Lower Paleolithic record, and also trying to look beyond Europe a bit. But he coins this phrase nasties, so name stool industries, or nasties, and as you can guess by the name, he's not a massive fan. So there has been various types of head-on criticism of this whole endeavor of cultural taxonomy, and what it is that we think we're doing with it, what it is that we think we can use it for. And so, I've been kind of conscious of this for a long time. But the way that I got into this, really got into this debate and really started getting interested in it, is I started asking myself, what does Gravettian mean? And the reason I was asking myself this was because back in 2016, I was doing a little bit of cover lecturing of some first-year undergraduates. And one of the things that I wanted to do in one of my lectures was to explain to them, okay, what do these terms mean? Aurignacian, Gravettian, Magdalenian, etc. Like, what do they mean? If you're just starting out in archaeology, you want to get your head around it. Like, what do you need to know? And I really struggled. I really, really, really struggled. And I realized that I'd managed to get through an entire PhD without figuring this out. So that sort of really began playing on my mind. And I was beginning to write papers, and I was finding as I wrote papers that I didn't really feel like I knew what I was talking about. So I did what I guess you do in this circumstance, and I started asking round. So I started asking people, like, what does Gravettian mean? I'd go up to people at conferences and I'd say, listen, have you got a definition of Gravettian? Because, I'd really like to have one. And the thing is that I couldn't get a good answer. And actually, very often people would say to me, oh, I don't really think it means anything. Maybe it's a techno-complex, sure, but they couldn't really give me a good answer. And then you say, okay, so what's a techno-complex? And they'd be like, pfft. So, you know, and I was having this conversation quite a lot. And it really bothered me. It really, really bothered me. Because for me, I think it's really important that words mean something. I think it's really important that we, you know, really basic terms in our discipline, I think we should know what they mean. We should agree on what they mean. And if we can't do that, then that means something's wrong. So I started, you know, thinking about this a lot more. I started reading papers with a view to trying to figure out what it was that people meant by these terms. So, you know, just, you know, whatever papers I happened to be reading, and I started this little document on my computer where I would like take out little quotations where I would see how people had used these terms. So, you know, just like in practice, how do people use these terms? How do people use Gravettian? How do people use origination? Etc. And the what I found in practice was the sort of range of things that I've shown you here on the slide. So one of the principal meanings is, of course, as a time period, but it's not just a time period. We know it's not just a time period. You know, there's a reason why, for example, if you have something from 28,000 years ago in Egypt, you don't call it Gravettian. Okay, these are terms that apply to a geographically bounded area as well. Very often you would see people talking about things like cultural units, entities, technological traditions, phenomenon, industry, etc. So these are things that are really like ideational. They're immaterial. They're abstract. They don't have a material form. And the idea is very often that there's something that existed in the past. In other cases, they're things that, you know, more reflexively are thought of as existing now. They're existing now in the minds of archaeologists. So people, I think, vary to what extent they believe that they're talking about something that actually existed in the past versus something that, you know, is a creation of modern day archaeologists. Another frequent usage of the term is as a chronostratigraphic unit. So, for example, what I wrote here, like the Gravettian is situated in level 7A, and you know, this is something that we say all the time when we're talking about different sequences and so on. And I think it's actually quite important because this usage of the Gravettian is something that, you know, exists within a sequence at a particular site. It's very different from those other things. That's really not the same as a time period. That's really not the same as like an abstract culture or an abstract, you know, archaeological construction. It's a very fundamentally, categorically different thing. Technocomplex is probably the thing that came up the most. Yeah, as I said before, this is a term that comes up a lot. This is a term that is used a lot in our literature, and often there's a sense that this is based in something technological. So this is based in something to do, especially with lithic technology. But it's very, very rare that anyone talks about a definition of technocomplex or where it is that they're getting their idea of what a technocomplex is from. Sometimes David Clarke is invoked, but as we will see shortly, the way that he defines technocomplex does not seem to line up with the way that it's used today in Upper Paleolithic discourse. So yeah, those are the ways it's used. Very often these entities are put into hierarchical relationships. So Pavlovian, for example, within the Gravettian, different phases of the ordination, etc. And so these things are, you know, the way I'm summarizing it is quite long, but to give an idea of the meanings that seem to be in use, geographically and temporally bounded entities with both material and ideational aspects, thought of in generally quite essentialist terms, and often closely correlated with imagined past populations. So, as I mentioned before, this idea of Magdalenians, Solutreans, etc. So, okay, that's all right. So that's kind of where we are now. That's kind of how it seems to be used in modern day practice. Where do these concepts come from? That's what I was interested in next. So, the first aspect of these origins that I want to talk about comes from essentially French prehistory. So, I'm in Bordeaux. A lot of stuff happens in this part of the world concerned with sorting out the Upper Paleolithic. And all the way back in 1873, Gabriel de Mortillet wrote about the Solutrean, or as he put it, l'époque de Solutré ou Solutréen. So there was this elision from a time period to a noun happened really early on in the study of the Upper Paleolithic. And where he's coming from with this was really a geologically influenced way of seeing the past. So he was looking at various sequences in caves and rock shelters, in particular, that were yielding these different sets of artifacts. He was trying to put some kind of order on them, and so he started naming these epochs, which then quickly became Solutrean, Magdalenian, etc. And there's this whole history of nearly 150 years now of people now trying to sort out all these different sequences, trying to put them together, and these units were used as part of that. So I've no time to go into it, but all of the like Le Bataille or Nassien, the Perigordian debate, all of this was about like trying to put together these sequences, these huge debates that went on for decades about how these sequences fit together, the different units that you use, etc. And these continue on in the present day. So for example, a lot of the debate that you have going on currently about the distinctions between proto-Aurignacian and Aurignacian assemblages, I think you can see as being part of this tradition. And there's been a long awareness of the possibility and yet the complexity of extending these units over larger geographical areas. So although they were obviously first recognized in southwestern France, it became very quickly apparent that there was analogies for them elsewhere in Europe and even beyond. So Garrett's work, for example, but then also the huge amount of work in other languages by people in Central Europe and Eastern Europe who were beginning to make these comparisons as well. And yet within France, I would say these units continue to be used despite the fact that there's been a huge amount of like really excellent detailed work done on figuring out the nuances of how they all fit together, the similarities and differences between them. We still use these units. They're still absolutely key to the organization of the study of the Upper Paleolithic here. So that's the first kind of part of the origin. So it comes from this need to look at stratigraphies, need to put things together. The second aspect is population concepts. And sometimes people say that, it's only kind of in like the mid-20th century or so that, archaeologists got really jealous of anthropologists. We wanted to start talking about, these these populations in the past. I don't think that's true. I think, it has much deeper roots than that. And so not everybody was doing this by any means, but certainly there were some very influential people who were doing this and who were equating these chronostratigraphic units, as they were, with populations. And this is also really heavily tied up with then current ideas of physical anthropology, of really essentialist notions of human populations. There's a lot of really racist ideas in there that, this all gets mixed up with. I really think this is worthy of more direct study than it's had to date, because I think it's important. But for the present discussion, it will suffice to say that we started, we as archaeologists started using these terms, and we never really stopped. Okay, so we started talking about the Solutreans and the Aurignacians, etc., and we still do. But where it comes from is this really essentialist notion of populations. This idea that you can divide populations up into groups, and you can give them a name, and there's something essential, and often some kind of racial difference between these different populations, and that's I think really at the base of these ideas. And I mean, you can see in the quotations that I've given you here on the screen the kind of language that's used. So this language of domination, of suppression, of some circumstances drove the Solutreans back from Central Europe along the way by which their ancestors had come. They crowded back on the Aurignacians and for a time kept them suppressed. This kind of language, and it's really interesting to see how this is actually kind of filtered down to us in the present day. So when then you see in the present day how these terms are still extremely accepted and well used, it kind of changes your viewpoint on them if you know a bit more of this history, or at least it certainly has for me. But obviously they're still used all the time. Not by everybody, but by quite a lot of people. So that's what I wanted to say about that. The third thing that I wanted to talk about here was about polythetic but hierarchized groupings. And so this especially comes from the work of David Clark, which was hugely influential, not only for Anglophone archaeologists, but also in the Soviet Union, enormously influential, and hence into post-Soviet Russia as well. In French language archaeology, it's also been extremely key to the development of ideas. And so I mean it's pretty well known what David Clark was saying. So this idea of polythetic groups of artifact types and so on that were helped to formulate a culture. And this hierarchical idea that he had, between assemblage, culture group, technocomplex. This idea that, you can sort of nested structure. What I've given you here at the at the bottom of the page is his definition of technocomplex. So a group of cultures characterized by assemblages sharing a polythetic range but differing specific types of the same general families of artifact types, shared as a widely diffused and interlinked response to common factors and environment, economy, and technology. The technocomplex is a huge system networking culture groups, cultures, assemblages, and artifact types. And And for me, that's interesting, first of all, because, as I said before, I don't think that's the sense in which most people are using technocomplex when they talk about, for example, the Aurignacian technocomplex or the Gravettian technocomplex. I don't think that that's exactly what they have in mind. And secondly, it's the fact that it's really quite an abstract thing that he's talking about. It's also this idea of like polythetic sets, which I've really struggled with like down the years. I've really kind of had to think about quite a lot, but which this idea of has been so influential. This idea that so for example, if you want to describe a culture, a technocomplex, for example, you can have A, B, C, D sort of types which characterize it. If you just have A and C, that's okay. If you have B and D at a different site, and then you have B and C at another site, there you go. Like they're all kind of unified within this like polythetic group. And in practice, it gets messy really, really fast. Obviously, and like as anyone who's kind of had experience of trying to do this will know, this idea of, okay, so I mean, because the archaeological record is so complex and there's so much going on in it, what do you do if you have something that looks a bit like A and also looks a bit like C? Do you include it or do you not include it? These things, and the like negotiation that then goes on with defining these groups, that just goes on for decades and decades, all these back and forth. And the ideas that Clark had, you can certainly see the similarities there with what Gordon Childe was saying not long before him. So when he was talking about his archaeological cultures, when he was talking about how they can be defined, so he was going with this idea that it's not just one kind of artifact type that defines a culture. You have to have several different artifact types that are found in that co-occur to define a culture. So this is the sort of theoretical position that he was putting out. So I mean, as he put it, a culture must be distinguished by a plurality of well-defined diagnostic types that are repeatedly and exclusively associated with one another. So this has been, I think, really important in shaping the ideas that we're using now in the present. A lot of the recent attempts at systematization have also followed a hierarchical framework. So, for example, the paper by Gamble and colleagues in 2005, where you see, you have these definitions of archaeological taxonomic units, etc. That also follows like a hierarchical structure, much like Clark's work. A lot of the work coming out of evolutionary archaeology has also followed quite a hierarchical structure. The work as well by Robert Dunnell back in the 70s, which gave us a lot of the vocabulary that we use, the terminology that we use. To a large extent, he was also working within a hierarchical framework. So these are, where all of this comes from. And so if you look now again at the cultural taxonomy of the Upper Paleolithic, you can see that maybe it's not quite so well established. Maybe it's not quite so settled as we might think. If we're just accustomed to using these units. There's so many different ways to doubt them. There's so many different reasons to think that we could probably do better at describing the Upper Paleolithic record. And okay, the negative effects of the framework as it exists today include the fact that it masks, to a large extent, the true variation that exists within the Upper Paleolithic record. It imposes an order and a structure on the Upper Paleolithic which is not necessarily accurate. And finally, it also puts Upper Paleolithic archaeology quite out of step with the archaeology of later periods. So obviously, in the study of later prehistory, there's been this huge backlash against notions of archaeological culture that's gone on for decades now, and they've developed different ways of talking about variability, similarity, etc. in the record, which we, to a large extent, have been left out of, and I think there's something quite regrettable about that. Now, to ask this question, which I think is really the key question, is it possible in principle to split the archaeological record into hierarchically structured discrete groupings? Because that's really what we need to know. If we can, great, we can try and do it. If we can't, then we need to find a different way of doing things. And so what are the necessary conditions for constructing a hierarchical framework of discrete units? And for me, the necessary conditions, and perhaps not everyone will agree, but for me, the necessary conditions are that the archaeological record has to actually form discrete units that are hierarchically structured. And that's not the case. So from everything that I know about the European Upper Paleolithic record, it doesn't fall into nicely bounded groups of sites. It doesn't even fall into nicely bounded groups of sites that are united in polythetic sets. It just doesn't. And there's no a priori reason why that should be the case. There's no reason why we should think the culture in the past should have worked like that. And although you can force the archaeological record into a framework like this, you have to throw out a lot of information. So you can make a framework that works, that is kind of logical, etc., but only if you ignore a huge amount of information, which for me is not a satisfactory way of doing things. And to give you an example of why I don't think this is the case, if you're not convinced, if I look at some of the material that I know the best, and so this is a highly simplified overview of a restricted number of sites from Russia and Belarus, and you can see that even though here I've managed to make a reasonably neat kind of a diagram of how they all overlap. It doesn't form a hierarchical structure. You can't force, using this information, you can't, impose a hierarchical structure on these sites without ignoring, at least some of the information that we have. And this is repeated for many different parts of the archaeological record. This is just one small and, relatively homogeneous part of the archaeological record. So, there's a lot more complexity that needs to be dealt with. So now, can we find a different way of doing things? And this is what I've been kind of mulling over in my head now for quite a long time. Is there a way of describing and visualizing the overall structure of the Upper Paleolithic archaeological record and formally describing it in a way that enables analysis and comparisons without using taxonomic units or imposing a hierarchical structure? Now, for me, variation does exist. It is geographically and chronologically patterned. It is worth understanding it. It is worth, being able to visualize it. It is worth being able to understand something about that structure. It is worth being able to use that structure in order to ask certain questions of the archaeological record. But for me, we need to find a way of describing that variation, which is non-hierarchical, because I don't see a hierarchical structure to the Upper Paleolithic record. It needs to be non-essentialist, because I don't see any reason why things should fall into nice, clean, discrete units. It needs to be extensible, revisable, transparent. It needs to be usable, essentially. We need to be able to add more information to it as we have it, and it needs to be a proper bottom-up approach. And this is the way that I've started, well, since quite a long time now. I've been thinking about the structure of the Upper Paleolithic record. And so to explain this to you, so this is a two-dimensional drawing of a 3D concept, so you're going to need to use your imagination a little bit. But we have space and time here. We have space in 2 dimensions, so the longitude and latitude that you can see in the X and the Y dimensions at the bottom. Think of it like a map. Think of it like a map of Europe, okay? And then we have time in the vertical dimension. And, you know, this is actually something that archaeologists are quite used to. This is the way that we think of stratigraphy, for example. So, you know, time, you know, later at the top, earlier at the bottom. And that's fine. So imagine sites, which are represented here as spheres or circles, as having a position in space and time. And then you think of the sites as being linked by certain similarities that they have. Because we know that there are very clear similarities between some of these sites. That's not in question. There's certain things that co-occur at them, which are, you know, very specific. And so we can draw lines between them based on the similarities that exist. So the shared presence of particular technology, particular type of artifact, particular type of ornaments, etc. And we can look for clusters. To give it to you in a different way, the picture on the left is, you know, a sort of highly simplified way of, you know, showing how we tend to do things at the moment. We tend to try to put things into boxes, which means that we end up losing quite a lot of information a lot of the time. And the way that I would prefer to look at things is the way on the right. So the idea is that you avoid putting things into boxes. You just look at the similarities that exist between sites, and you look at as many of them as at the same time as you can. So we're looking for clustering, essentially, within the record, which is based on the amount of similarity between sites. And there's a very basic theoretical underpinning for this, which is that similarity and difference in the archaeological record reflect sociocultural processes in the past. So, you know, if things are close in space and time and they look similar to each other, that's, you know, probably telling us something about, you know, the connections between the people who made those sites or who made those assemblages in the past. They don't have to be direct connections. They can be, you know, connections of belonging to, you know, a shared tradition that we're just being part of, etc. But that's basically all there is to it. And so I mentioned already that there's a lot of different ways that we might see similarity between sites. And so I want to introduce a concept of index features, which is similar to the index fossil idea that most of us will be familiar with, but it has a wider sense. So the idea is, so rather than index fossils, which tend to be just lithic artifact types that are used as fossiles directeurs, which are used to look for similarity between different sites. We can use anything. So we can use lithic artifact types, sure, but we can also use technological features, we can use personal ornaments, we can use construction styles, anything you like. And the idea is that you very carefully and explicitly define these features. That's important because it has to be replicable. But, you know, I've given you a whole list there of, different types of things that you can use. So, as potentially, showing links between different sites. One thing to point out here is that for me, a single artifact can be an attestation of more than one index feature at a time. So the idea is not to take every artifact and to say, okay, it's this or it's that. It can be this and that at the same time. That's fine. And that means that, if you come up with more definitions, if, for example, you come up with a more specific definition, or, conversely, if you want to group things, that's fine. You just add another definition to the list that you're using. So, for example, an artifact can be both a shouldered point and a Kostyankiyev-Deva type shouldered point at the same time. It can be a backed bladelet and an element bitronqué at the same time. That's fine. And in that case, you just draw 2 lines, potentially, instead of 1, as needs be. Not every artifact will be usable as an index feature. That hopefully goes without saying. So, not everything is useful for doing this type of comparison. And I want to give you an example of how this can work in practice, again, based on the part of the record that I know the best. Highly simplified, so don't take it too seriously, but it shows you how this can work in practice. What I'm showing you here is a number of Gravettian sites found in Russia and Ukraine, which I've, given attributes to essentially based on the presence of the various features that are defined at the right-hand side. And then I've drawn lines between them. And the reason I did this was because I was struggling with this idea of the Kostyankiyev-Deva culture, the fact that Khotilova 2, for example, has most of the features, but not all of them. And I needed to find a way of presenting this. I couldn't just put these. I didn't want to just make a box that was called Kostyankiyev-Deva culture and then say Khotilova 2. Well, maybe it's in the box, maybe it's not in the box. It spends however long just talking about whether or not it's in the box or not. The point is that this is the record as it is. And how do I present that? How do I show that? How do I show this structure that appears to exist? So the yellow lines join the sites where backed lithics are found. So these are found in all Gravettian sites. It's basically what defines them. But then we have these other features as well. And the dotted lines that you see going off to the left are going off to Central Europe, where in many cases these features are also found. I could have also added a whole heap of yellow lines going up to more recent sites to join with epigravettian sites. But this is the a very early first attempt at doing this kind of thing in practice based on a part of the archaeological record that I actually know. What's the point of doing this? Because I know that on one level this is really trivial what I'm doing. This is sort of just going back and looking at sites and making a list of okay, so what things are found here, what things are not found here. But I think there's actually something to it. First of all, it provides a basis for looking at variation where we don't have to ever put anything into boxes, ever. We don't ever have to talk about whether a site should be described as proto-Aurignacian, or for that matter, what is the proto-Aurignacian, or what is the Gravettian, etc. If you really want to, you can put circles around groups of sites, but you don't have to. So I think it actually allows us, if we were to do this on a large scale, it would allow us to get past a lot of these questions that have plagued archaeology for so long. It provides a model that can replace the model that we've been working with, the cultural taxonomic framework model that we've been working with for decades, and which, as I've hopefully shown, has many drawbacks for how we do archaeology. It's transparent. It's not based on statistics that people get a little bit sort of nervous about because they don't necessarily understand exactly what's going on. It's very simple. It's presence, absence. And although it would be really a big endeavor to do this on a large scale, a lot of the work has already been done. We know a lot about various various index fossils, various technological features, the use of various materials at different sites. So there's lots of stuff that we could already put into a framework like this. And it can provide structure for comparative studies. It can provide, a basis for comparison with other types of data. It's also infinitely extensible. We can we can go geographically bigger. We can go temporally bigger. We can add, as much stuff as we want. There's no real limit to it. And finally, it refocuses attention on the real variation that's in the archaeological record. So the idea is that you're not looking anymore at these boxes that we've made. We're not looking anymore at these techno-complexes that we don't even know what they are. We're looking at individual assemblages. What's the variation that we see between them? Still various things to be worked out. So I've been kind of doing this by hand so far, but there's various tools that I'm certain that we can find to use for visualizing, for analyzing. Underlying this is essentially just a presence-absent matrix, which is, there's many different tools that exist for analyzing that. Different things to talk about, weighting perhaps of different types of types of feature, dealing with convergence problems, dealing with the no data versus absence problem. That's very important. Other things, so working with chronological uncertainty, how to include that into a model. Potentially, although I'm not even sure that this is necessary, but potentially going beyond simple presence absence and looking at actual numbers of features, etc. Either relative or absolute within a site. And then finally, dealing with palimpsest assemblages, dealing with assemblages that are actually very thick layers and caves where there's a huge amount of activity from a long period of time that's represented there. So all of these things to be worked out. But I think just the sort of the basic concepts that are presented hopefully has something to it. I'm going to try doing this now for the results from my present project that I'm working on, which is on personal ornaments from Eastern Europe. So we'll see how that goes. Very quickly now, because I know I've gone a little bit over time. Sometimes people get a little bit concerned when I start talking about this idea of let's get rid of our terms. Let's get rid of these terms like ordination and graffiti and etc. What are we going to talk about? And I'm like, no, this is great. I would really be happy never to have to talk about these terms ever again. I mean, in terms of just communication, organization, etc., within our discipline, there's no reason why we can't, continue to use chronological terms. So, for example, I could talk about myself as being specialized in the study of the Middle Upper Paleolithic of Eastern Europe, rather than, the Gravettian of Eastern Europe, as I would probably say at the moment. And there's also just, that's not really a problem. And then in terms of, what kind of questions do we ask? It's like, well, we can ask the really interesting questions. So I've just given you like a quick list of, the sort of questions that you can ask that, have no relevance or, that have no requirement for thinking about, whether a site is, Aurignacian or Gravettian, etc. There's so many interesting questions that we can ask about the Upper Paleolithic records that don't reference these terms. And I would prefer to be asking those questions, than, continuing to debate whether or not a site belongs to this or that group, for several more decades. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks, again for the opportunity to do this remotely. This has been the first time that I've done this. It's been really quite strange. I'm just talking to myself in a room with my laptop in front of me. But okay. I hope it's been all right. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you in a few minutes. All right. Take care. Bye.